Why does a lot of modern science fiction and modern fantasy suck? And hopefully this isn't me just going into FUD mode, explaining, that everything was fantastic when I was a kid, and now it all is horrible. Not true at all. I mean, we've seen some great stuff come out lately. The Expanse being a very good example. Um, Game of Thrones was good as long as it had source material, and then it kind of collapsed after that. But I think to a certain extent the seeds of its own destruction were hiding in there. So, what's going on? Why are there so many different attempts at sci-fi and fantasy that don't work well, just don't come off well? I have what I believe are the 6 primary causes of this. Okay, well, obviously this is a big problem I think our entire country is having, and we're seeing it mirrored in Hollywood and every place else. And that is the total fear of risk. Everybody wants to work off an established intellectual property. They want to be able to go, we've got an established fan base already. Even if we have something that hasn't been used in 10 or 20 years, we want to see if we can leverage that existing fan base. We want to try to reuse that trademarked name that has already have branding that'll bring people in. And I think that's a lot of the reasons for what is happening in sci-fi and fantasy. Is if you're afraid to allow people to try something new, and you constantly try to shoehorn them back into intellectual property that doesn't make sense. I mean, you could take a lot of the shows, especially, what they're doing with Star Trek. Half those stories, you literally could just say, okay, call it anything else. It's literally a brand new thing. You don't, but, they have characters. They have essentially everything that goes for the world, the universe, is wrong. So there's no reason to use these IPs other than the fact you want to pillage the name, and it blows up in their face, which I think they're finally figuring out. Okay. And especially for the ones that are using old intellectual property and trying to revamp it, they desperately want to be close to the original action. So rather than coming up with something new, they try to shoehorn themselves into timeline niches that don't give them freedom of action. Now, they take freedom of action, but it's freedom of action they shouldn't have, because they run into a problem of conflicting with the existing timeline, conflicting with canon, and other problems like that, which gets into another issue. Overwhelmingly, a lot of these new shows fail to understand the concept of canon. They fail to understand the concept of rules. They fail to understand the concept of physics. Canon is one of these things that I think I want to do another video on, but it's the general idea that you've got a universe. There might be different sources of information that go into the universe. There may be TV shows, there may be movies, there may be books, all kinds of different things. Canon is what of that material is considered to be the absolute fact of what happened and how things work. A lot of these new writers don't grasp canon, and they're just like, well, we don't have to follow it because we're just going to do what we want. And they don't understand. That's very irritating to the people who actually understand how things are supposed to work. The other issue comes down in terms of rules. Now, we see a lot of this as a big problem in a lot of the superhero movies. And what I mean by rules is there has to be some sort of limiting factor on what people can and cannot do. And those rules may not be immediately apparent to the audience and may slowly appear over time, but the rules are there to give the character something to strive against or towards or for. So if you just random, and one of the good example of a big problem area was of course Star Wars with the various force powers, where there was already an established rule system saying, okay, this one side here uses these powers, this side over here uses the other powers, and certain powers are very limited or have never appeared before, and these people just go, oh, well, it's space wizards with laser swords, and they go out there and let them do whatever they want, and then they wonder why the fans get mad. Well, if your character can just randomly come up with any power it wants, it's not a very interesting character. Imagine if Superman had no kryptonite. He would be a horrible character because there'd be absolutely no way of containing him. So there's literally nothing he can't do. With kryptonite, at least there's things people can do to either slow him down or stop him or make him, have to think his way through a problem rather than just punching through and using his laser vision. Now, not all science fiction needs to be absolutely physics driven. I thought a really good example of this was Battlestar Galactica's reboot. Another show that kind of blew up in the middle, but the first couple seasons were absolutely fantastic. So, the really cool thing about Battlestar is they came up with a really clever way to avoid themselves from getting bogged down in the physics. They essentially had one guy who understood all the science, and he was the bad guy, or at least a problematic guy at least. So you had a situation where every time something science came up, everyone had to go to Baltar. And the military guys would just say, oh, I'm just a dumb grunt and I don't really understand this stuff, Doc, so you work it out. And so he never had to fully explain exactly how everything worked, but it still looked really good. Whereas if you look at something like Next Generation, very physics heavy. The original series actually was pretty good on its physics for what they understood at the time. Every once in a while they'd go out there on things, but information wasn't as readily available to them as it is to us. So if you can do anything you want, it ruins your show. And you either have to have somebody give you you have to have an advisor who either understands physics really well, or you have to know how to cover up your physics to where it's something that happens in the background that you don't try to force upon people. Like you don't want to do space sonar like the current Discovery series apparently tried to do. Okay. Now, this is something I got from Critical Drinker that I absolutely agree with. And a lot of the crop of writers coming up now lack world experiences. You're talking about, okay, give you an example, like people who were writing for a show like the original Star Trek. A lot of them were probably military veterans. A lot of them had probably gone overseas. They had all kinds of real world experiences to play off of. So you probably see like some of the cultures, something they saw when they were overseas that they integrated into a show. When there's some form of combat going on, it's based loosely on something that actually happened or something they saw, or maybe a war story somebody told them, even if they weren't directly involved in things. If you look at the age of a lot of the people who are writing now, pardon the stereotype, but I mean, you're talking about people whose worst experience in the world was probably an overheated latte. So this causes huge problems in that their experiences, if they have something, let's say they have a really good story idea to write about, at the best, they might be just looking at older material and copying it and trying to update it. But it's probably a lot worse than that, where a lot of them have no real world experience. And I think we see this bleeding in when we see the whole like throwing in real world politics and social ideas as part of the main character line. Now, I know a lot of people, oh, you don't know anything because Star Trek was always leftist. Well, yeah, but not stupid. Okay, like for instance, if we look at the first two iterations of Star Trek, the idea of racial disharmony is just completely gone. It's been completely overcome. Humanity is a much better place. I love this one little episode where basically some alien shows up as a recreation of Lincoln, and he sees Uhura and says, "Oh, what a charming negress." And then he realizes, oh, that's probably an out-of-date term that might be insulting. I'm really sorry. She goes, oh, there's no need to apologize. We've learned as a people to overcome things like that. We're proud and happy of who we are and what we are. And it's just this beautiful little segment. But the thing is, they still get into things like race. Now, maybe it comes off a little bit more heavy-handed than what we're used to. Good example of that in the original was you had the race that was black on one side, white on the other, and vice versa for the other. And it presents a very good picture where you just look, oh, these are pretty much the same people. And then they point out the difference to you, and to them it's critical. And it kind of makes you think. So that's the difference between writing stupid and not writing stupid. Whereas a story in in the original series or Next Generation might make you go, oh wow, that's a really interesting point. Whereas the new writers want to basically grab you by the back of the head and go, you will get this right. And so they reinsert race and modern social ideas directly into their story, coming out of the mouths of characters who are supposed to have transcended all this. And it's just painful to watch. Okay. So I remember a tagline that came up when they were trying to pitch Discovery, and their big thing is, it's not your father's sci-fi. And it shows really a horrible lack of understanding of what science fiction was at any particular time. See, these guys are so ignorant that they think that the original Star Trek was written the way it was because they were afraid to be dark. That's absolutely wrong, because if you look at the sci-fi of that time, almost all of it was dark. It was not bright, cheery stuff. You had UFO, very dark show. Show would be fantastic if somebody rebooted it and gave it a proper feel for today. Space 1999, not a bright, very xenophobic, very dark. Twilight Zone, Outer Limits. You're talking about a period where all the sci-fi had a bit of darkness. I mean, the only one that was a little bit on the light side was lost in space only because they kind of ran out of their serious story and decided to go campy. But it wasn't the original idea. The original one was, very dark, spies and sabotage and things like that. So Gene Roddenberry's original sci-fi, Star Trek, was a huge exception. It was this bright, cheery future where humanity had overcome the worst of its elements, and now, was showing its absolute best as it went along. It wasn't a fear of doing things darkly, or it wasn't a fear of showing things how they work. They were willing to take the social issues, but they made it more palatable by throwing them into the other cultures and races, and specifically alien races, to understand. So when these fools come back and basically reinsert modern social ideas directly into the characters, and the characters are talking, characters 200-300 years in the future are talking like it's this week in 2022, is just hideously bad writing, and it's a really horrible understanding of what was going on at the time. And I have no problem with dark. I mean, the original Battlestar Galactica had elements of dark, but at the same time, they were trying to keep it not too horrible for the audience at the time, because their target audience was children and teens and geeks. But the thing is it wasn't a happy, bright world. I mean, essentially, it's the remnants of humanity fleeing from murder robots. And the reboot of Battlestar Galactica properly brought that feeling out and put it into a really good perspective. I think one of the things that also falls into it is the idea of jealousy versus envy. Now, if you're jealous of something, it means, like for instance, if you're jealous of another person, you kind of want to be that person. You kind of are thinking, if I had the lucky breaks and everything happened the way I wanted it to, that could almost be me. If everything lined up right, I could almost be that person, or at least I could pick up aspects of that person. Whereas you're envious, you go, I could never be that person. I have no ability to ever be that person. I want to destroy that person. And I thought a really good example of this comes out with, I saw Black Mirror, I believe it was called The McAllister, and it was a virtual reality type thing where this awful geek programmer recreates his favorite 60s sci-fi series as a virtual world, and he's somehow locking up it not too well written, but essentially he could take people's DNA and somehow reform their personalities in there, and he kept them prisoner and tortured them. And it could have been an interesting story there, and there were some interesting elements in terms of the idea of what happens when things start becoming AI-ish, and at the same time you have a human that's in absolute control of them, or where they could be a horrible dictator. But I bring this up because it was very clearly meant to be a parody of Star Trek. And it's hateful. I mean, you could tell the people who wrote it absolutely despised Star Trek and everything in it. Because there was no love in it at all. It wasn't like a Galaxy Quest where it's kind of poking lighthearted fun at the genre. They clearly hated it. And I had a couple people tell me, oh, no, you're just not interpreting that right. And then I started hearing later other people just confirming, oh yeah, that not only do we hate the original Star Trek, we hate Jim Kirk more than anything else. And so that kind of puts things into perspective when you look, if you're jealous of someone like Jim Kirk, you say, huh, there are elements there I could achieve or I'd really like to achieve. The envious says, no, I could never be that. I have to destroy it. And we see this with a lot of these shows, reboots and everything, where they have to deconstruct everything. And if you're deconstructing, you're not showing jealousy, you're not showing respect, you're just showing pure, raging, dark, vile envy. And yeah, and you can't possibly make something good out of that. All you're going to do is attract a small following of people who are dark, horrible, envious people too. So I think that sums up where we are a lot in terms of science fiction. But just say, so I'm not just being an old timer. I mean, not everything from my childhood was good. I mean, Lost in Space is its own kind of weird thing. There are a lot of shows that came out that were just absolutely silly. And there are good things now. In addition to The Expanse, The Orville is very fantastic. There's an example of a loving parody. So that's my take on sci-fi and fantasy at the moment. I might delve into individual shows at some point. I don't know. It's not really. I'm leaning more towards keeping these videos towards history, politics, and current events. But I think our culture is a major part of what is happening with our politics as well. So, hope you enjoy that. Thank you for watching. Keep an eye out for more of my videos.